Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, I'm going to show you how to take complete control of keyboard input in a Blazor application. Sure, you can handle keyboard events in a Blazor component, but you can't tell Blazor to stop the key from being handled by the browser once you're done with it. At least in .NET 5, it's just not possible. So we're going to have to resort to a little JavaScript interop to solve this problem. And that's coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. All right, so I'm starting with a Blazor server project called Keyboard Input. Doesn't really matter what it's called, but it's a Blazor server project. I need to say that this works just as well in Blazor WebAssembly as it does in server. We're going to be using some JavaScript, but before we get into any of that, let's just add a couple of inputs to index here, and we'll talk about what the current behavior is, and then what we want to happen. So let's just run this. I've got 3 inputs here with 3 different IDs, input 1, input 2, input 3, and 3 different values, this, that, and the other. So here you go. Now, the standard thing is that when you press tab in a browser, every control, every element that is on the screen or allows tab stops gets focus, right? And you can press Shift Tab and go backwards. But watch this. Boom. Now I'm like up here. Why is that, right? And now I'm in the browser window, the address bar. I want, in this case, to be able to control the tab key so that it only goes between these fields here, just what's on the screen. And so that means I have to get control when the tab key is pressed, and I also have to stop it from going any further. I have to disable propagation, or the default behavior. I have to say I don't want that to go through to the browser. When I press tab right now, I want it to go here. The other thing that I want is, look at the cursor, the caret, right? I'm pressing the arrow keys to go through all of the characters in this input. Right arrow, right arrow, right arrow, right arrow. And when I get here and I press the right arrow, I want to go to this field. Because, there's a lot of people that expect this behavior from keyboard input. So the point of this isn't that you should set up your behavior like this. All I'm saying is I want to be able to control it. And in this demo, that's what I want to make happen. Once you have control over the keyboard input in Blazor, then you can do it yourself and set up your own rules. So that's what we want to achieve here. Now, the very first thing I'm going to do is add some JavaScript to support what we're going to do. If you wanted to create a component and have some scope JavaScript, that would also work. I'm just going to put it here because this is the easiest way to do it. And let's start with this. This is an enumeration, and we're setting the values of this enumeration or this array according to the keys, the key codes, right? This is very, very helpful. I essentially found this on the internet and just put it in here in JavaScript so that we can use this rather than deal with the numbers themselves. Now, up at the top of the script tag, we have this enable keyboard capture method. And we're going to pass in the Blazor component reference, right, as we have done before. If you see the JavaScript interop show, that's what we did there. And so I have these Booleans for Shift, Alt, and Control pressed because those are modifiers, right? I not only want to know what key was pressed, but if Shift is down, Alt is down, or Control is down. We're going to call this once when we want to start capturing the keyboard. So here we're handling the onKeyDown event of the document. I'm not going to get into whether we should use window or we should use document. Both would work, but as you know, there might already be handlers. In fact, there are handlers in the browser for window events. So I'm keeping it to the document for this demo. But, if you find yourself needing to handle the window onKeyDown, well, now you know how to do it. So there are 3 main keyboard events. You have on key down, which is the first thing that executes. And then you have on key up, which is the next thing. And then you have on key press, right? On key down, on key press, on key up. So we're starting with down. So if it's Shift, Control, or Alt, and look at this. This is why we have this enum here. We're going to set the appropriate flag. And then down here, we're also handling on key up. And we're now checking Shift, Control, and Alt. And if those were released, then we're setting them to false accordingly. All right, so now let's handle all the keys that we want to swallow. So this is the swallow code right here. Event, prevent default, stop propagation, cancel bubble, and eventually return value equals false. It's just a really fortified way to ensure that nobody else can handle this right now. So for tab, up arrow, down arrow, left arrow, right arrow, we want control over those, and we are going to invoke this method so we get the key. But in the case of all of these, we want it to stop right here. In other words, after this happens, the on key up event will not fire. So for all other keys, we're just going to invoke this window key down, which is our Blazor code. But take a look. I'm converting the key code to a string and then to an integer and passing Shift, Control, and Alt with every key. And the same with on key up. Now I also have this set focus, which I've talked about before. It's a little JavaScript trick to make sure that when you set focus to an element that it exists, and then wait until it exists if you're doing it in code that executes before the render happens. So this is just an easy way to get around that. Basically, when we say set focus with an ID, we're calling this internal set focus on a timeout of 10 milliseconds. And then if the element is not yet there, we're going to call ourselves again after 10 milliseconds and return. So these two methods only execute if this is valid. Otherwise, it waits and it does it again. How many times? 2, 3, who knows? Okay, now if we want to handle these key codes, this enum, we need a C# equivalent of it. So I'm going to add that right now. And there you have it, public enum key codes. So now that we have that, let's modify our index to handle this keyboard input. All right, so starting at the bottom, we're handling on after render async. And if it is the first render, that's when we're going to say enable keyboard capture, just for this demo. We'll be able to turn it off and on later, but let's just start here. Now, I've got my 3 inputs at the top here, but I've also added this on click to call set input index. Well, what's with the index? All right, I could have hard-coded, input 1, input 2, input 3 as different strings for the demo, but to make it a little more customizable, I basically put these input IDs into a string array, input IDs, input 1, input 2, input 3. All right, because the idea is we have to pass those IDs to JavaScript if we want to set focus or do anything like that. So I'm also keeping track of the current input index because that tells us which element to pass to JavaScript. And when we click on one of these, we want to call set input index and change our index accordingly. So here is my window key down. It's JS invocable and async task. So that allows me to call it from JavaScript. Here's the key code, which is now our C# enumeration with the same values, of course. And then I have Booleans for Shift, Control, and Alt. I've also got this key pressed string, which I'm going to show right below my div of inputs. So anytime a key is pressed, I'm setting key pressed, that string, to an empty string. And I'm building up a key pressed string here. Shift, Control, Alt. And this little trick right here gets the name of the code in the enumeration. So you would see Shift tab, Control tab, Control Alt, whatever, that's what's pressed. And now we do some checking. So in my case, if the key code is tab and shift is true, we're going to call a method called movePrevious, which I haven't shown you yet. Otherwise, we're going to move next. Right arrow, move next. Down arrow, move next. Left arrow, move previous. Up arrow, move previous. And I have the window key up here just because you might want to do some testing. Whatever, we're not going to use it in the demo. So here's my move next and move previous. So I essentially want to do this with move next. I want to increase current input index, but that's only if we're not already at the last field. If we are at the last field, we're going to set current input index to 0, so we go back to the first one. And then I'm calling set focus with the correct input ID. Move previous just does that in reverse. If my index is greater than 0, I'm going to subtract 1. Otherwise, I'm going to set it to the last index. So let's see what happens. All right, so I'm just going to hit tab. And it hasn't triggered this yet because we're not in the document. Now I'm in the document, and you can see tab was pressed. Tab, tab, tab again. Okay, let's see. Right arrow, left arrow, left arrow, down arrow, down arrow, down arrow, up arrow, up arrow, up arrow, up arrow. Let's do shift tab. And it goes backwards. And if I keep doing shift tab, it keeps going backwards. And we now have complete control over all of this stuff. There might be other ways to do this, but I found this works really well, and I'll tell you why. Let's go back to the JavaScript here. There is a way that you can return a value from C# if you make this task of int, or task of bool, right? And you return true or false based on whether you want to swallow the key so that you can make the decision here. Here's the problem. Typically, in Blazor, when you get a key event, you might actually want to do something. You might want to call into an API. You might want to do something that takes some time. And meanwhile, JavaScript is getting the key up event. So you're going to have an asynchronous problem. So that's why I decided to do the logic here in JavaScript. So this is just how I ended up doing it. But I hope you're seeing the mechanism here, and with the enum and all of that stuff, to be able to control keyboard input. Now let's make our demo allow us to turn this on and off. So we're going to have a button, and when we click the button, that's when we're going to call this enable keyboard capture. So to turn it off, we're going to add disable keyboard capture, and we're just going to set these events to null. Now here's a caveat. If they were already set to something else beforehand, you might want to, here in enable keyboard capture, capture what they are, capture those events, and hold them, up here somewhere as variables. And so then when you disable the keyboard capture, you can reset it to what it was. But for this demo, I think you get the idea. All right, now let's modify index razor to use this button. It's a little bit different. Now on after render is no longer async because we're not doing anything asynchronously. We're not calling enable keyboard capture right here, but we are getting the reference to this .NET component because we're going to need to call that a couple of times with the same component. So let's just get a reference to this. If I press F12, you can see I've got the reference up here. So here's my button, and I've even extracted out the text of the button. Basically, it's going to start with capture keyboard, and then when we click it with enable keyboard capture, I'm going to set the text to press escape to exit capture mode. So now what the demo is going to do is when I press escape, I'm going to handle that, and then I'm going to call disable. Follow me? We also set this disabled property, and it is disabled because that's the attribute that we need to change. So that is going to enable and disable the button. So we have to handle escape to disable it, and there it is. All right, let's run it and see what happens. All right, so now here's the default behavior, just like I showed you earlier. And now if I do capture keyboard and I press tab, we go right there. Tab, 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 left arrow, right arrow, right? And now if I press escape, boom. Now if I press tab, we're back to the standard giving up control over the keyboard. But wait, there's more. Let's say we're capturing the keyboard and everything's cool. And then we go navigate off the page. Counter, whatever, and then come back. All right, it looks like I'm not capturing the keyboard here, but in fact, I am. So if I press capture keyboard here, it's redundant, right? This is not a correct UI state. And the reason is, remember in the app state episode, that these variables right here go away and get reinitialized when you navigate away from the page, or back to the page actually is when they get reinitialized. However, the JavaScript isn't part of this. So what I need to do is I need to hook the navigation manager, and when we change location, disable. So let's do that here. Here's our navigation manager. Let's get a method, location changed, that we're going to handle. And when we do get this location changed, we're going to call disable keyboard capture. Disable keyboard capture, if you remember, just sets on key down and on key up to null. If it's already null, doesn't matter. So I don't have to check anything here. So now we just need to wire up this event. And let's do it right here. Navigation manager dot location changed, add location changed. Okay, so here we are capturing the keyboard. I'm not going to press escape, but I'm going to go to counter or fetch data, and I'm going to go back home and look at this. We're back to non-capture mode, which is reflected by the UI. And now there's one more stupid trick. When we're in capture mode, I can't use the right and left arrow keys to go between the characters in the input tag. You can see that my caret is on right after the I in this. And if I press the right arrow, I want it to go after the S. But instead it goes right to the next field. So what I want is a sort of a hybrid thing where I want to allow the user to use the arrow keys in between the characters, but when we get to the end and we press right, that's when I want to go here. And if we're at the beginning and I press left, that's when we want to move previous. Does that make sense? It is doable. Let me show you how I figured that out. So I'm going to replace all this script right here, all the way down to Keycodes. All right, you can see in set focus that I've saved the ID that we want to set focus to this guy right here, selected element ID. So I've just initialized selected element ID as an empty string. Now I've added this function. Now this is not accessible from Blazor, but it's a private function, get element caret position. All right, so this is assuming we have a selected element ID, and I'm initializing the result to -1. Here's what the results can be. -1 if the caret position is somewhere in the middle, 1 if it's at the end, and 0 if it's at the beginning. So that's what all of this does. By default, we're going to return -1. We're going to get the element reference, and if it's not null, then we're going to get both the start and end position. Now, they have to be the same in order for this to work, right? If you've got something selected, it's going to return -1. So if they are the same, and the start position is at the last position, we'll return 1. And if the start position is 0, we're going to return 0. So now, in Enable Keyboard Capture, let's take a look here. The first thing I've done is copy the key code toString parseInt to this variable code. It just makes it easier. So now I'm doing some special stuff for these keys, all right? Now all of these call raise key down event. This is all of the code that we had before in the case just for these things, but we want to do something first before we call these. and we want to do a check. So let's do left and right arrow. But left arrow, we're only going to call the key down event if the get element caret position returns 0. And right arrow, we're only going to raise the event if get element caret position is 1. And the same with up and down. So that's the only change that I made. We're just doing a little check right here in JavaScript to see if we're at the beginning or the end. Now there's one other thing that I need to do in index. If I click into one of these inputs and set input index is called, right here, I need to call set focus, because set focus is where we set the selected element ID. All right. So let's just change this. So I change it to async because I'm going to call JavaScript, and I'm only going to call set focus if the current input index is not the index that we're clicking on. In other words, if I don't do this little test and I click on an element, if I've got focus, it's just going to select everything. So I don't want that. I only want to make this call if this is a new field. If we're on some field has focus and then we click on it, oh, this is a new field. Current input index does not equal this index, so that's when we're going to do set focus. All right, let's see how it works. All right, we'll capture the keyboard. Now I can click inside, and when I go to the end and I press right, boom, there we go. Now I press the arrows. I can use the arrows again. If I get to the beginning and I press the left arrow, that one gets processed. So I can still tab, of course, and shift tab, but now I have the freedom to use the left and right within the field and only go to the next field if we're at the end. Only go to the previous field if we're at the beginning. And that's the end of my demo today. I hope it was helpful. Now back to you in the studio, Carl. I never thought of myself as a control freak. I'm definitely a shift freak and maybe even an alt freak, but no. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blaze a trail.